Okay, Pontius Pilate, part 2. So, like I was saying, Paul Maier, I think, does an interesting job of trying to explain why Pilate did the things that he did, even though from the other Jewish historians he comes off as a bad guy. Maier is trying to explain maybe what actually happened, and presents maybe some plausible scenarios. And I think it's a fascinating read, no matter whether you're a Christian or a skeptic. Although the target audience for the book is Christians, and there's a large portion of the middle of the book which is just devoted to retelling the Passion story. Now, that part of the book, the trial of Jesus, was arguably the least interesting part of the book, at least for me. Partly, because I was a skeptic, so I was a little critical of it. Partly because I already knew that story so well. It's the other historical details about the life of Pilate that I found more interesting. During some of the sections about the trial of Jesus, Paul Maier in the book leaves Pilate behind to go and narrate some of the other stuff that's happening, like the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin, etc., which I thought was cheating a little bit. Pontius Pilate is the point of view character in this book. You have to stick with him. Those are the rules. If Pilate doesn't know about it, or if Pilate wasn't there, then it shouldn't be included in the novel. But Paul Maier, of course, is of a different mindset. So he leaves behind Pontius Pilate for a bit and takes us into the Sanhedrin and the trial of Jesus. What's interesting about those sections, and I think maybe the principal reason why Paul Maier wanted to do that, and Paul Maier is a smart guy. He's a doctor, a professor of ancient history, PhD, all this stuff. He goes through and he narrates the trial of Jesus, but he points out all the Jewish laws that were broken during the trial of Jesus. Like it shouldn't have happened as late as night as it did. It should have waited till morning. They should have had 2 days after he was condemned before they gave him his punishment. The whole thing was very rushed in a way that was against Jewish law. And as I was reading these sections, I did vaguely remember, I've heard this somewhere before. One of the other books on the Bible I was reading pointed this out. I forget which book. This is something that's, again, used by skeptics to say that the biblical account of the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin isn't historically accurate because it doesn't follow what was supposed to be the Jewish law at the time. Paul Maier, after pointing all that out, goes on to explain it away by saying, well, okay, the emotions were heated, they found these loopholes, they disregarded some parts of the law just because they were so impatient to kill Jesus, etc. And, again, I don't know, it may or may not be a plausible explanation for why the trial of Jesus before the Jewish authorities seems to not align with what we know about what Jewish law at the time was supposed to be. The other thing, while I'm getting all my criticisms out of the way, is that the one big omission in this book, I thought, was the language issue. So, when you're reading the New Testament or something, when you're reading these stories in English, and when everything's translated into English, it's easy to forget that these people were not actually speaking English. And in fact, they were not all speaking the same languages. So Pontius Pilate is a Roman, right? So he speaks Latin, but because he's an educated Roman, he also knows Greek. And to his credit, Paul Maier mentions this. So as Pontius Pilate is going over to Palestine from Italy, He's dusting off his rusty Greek, and he knows that Greek is going to be the lingua franca of communication over there. But, somebody correct me if I'm getting this wrong. Jesus did not speak Greek, right? Jesus spoke, and his disciples spoke Aramaic, and Jesus would not have known Greek. So there are some scenes when Pilate's wife is going out of the palace to kind of investigate this Jesus figure. And she sees and hears Jesus speaking. Some of the time, it's explicitly stated that the people around her are telling her what's going on. So I assume that means translating for her, among other things. Some of the time it's not explicitly stated, and you're like, okay, what's going on? Is she able to understand Aramaic? But I assume that you're just meant to assume that somebody was translating for her during those times. But then the big problem, I thought, was when Jesus was before Pilate. So you may remember this from the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, Pilate is arguing back and forth with the crowd, but then in the Gospel of John, there's a part where Pilate takes Jesus aside into the palace and talks to him privately. And that, because Paul Maier is a Christian who believes that everything in the New Testament is historically accurate, he reproduces that scene here. And I was waiting to see, okay, how is he going to get around the language issue? Pilate and Jesus don't speak the same language. Nothing. There's nothing there. And again, Paul Maier is a smart guy, so be interesting to quiz him on what he thought was going on in that scene. Does he think Jesus knew Greek? Does he think Pilate knew Aramaic? I don't know. Yeah. Unfortunately, Paul Maier was just on Wikipedia. He just passed away just this year. So, unless there's... I'll never be able to ask him those questions. I don't know if he addresses this anywhere else in his interviews or writings or something. But, yeah. So that would, I guess, be my main criticism of this, is that the language issue is never addressed. Everything else, I think Paul Maier is doing a good job of plausibly arguing for his point of view. It's the language thing that sticks in my craw, so to speak. The other thing, if you want to be nitpicky, is there's a passage in Matthew that skeptics love to point out. So Thomas Paine talks about this. Christopher Hitchens talks about this. It's after Jesus dies, there's an earthquake, and lots of the saints rise up from the dead and go around and meet people and go back to their families, and everybody sees them. And that's, needless to say, not reported in any other historical document, not reported anywhere else in the New Testament, only in the Gospel of Matthew. And so Thomas Paine and Christopher Hitchens say, well, look, this couldn't possibly happen because if there was a whole bunch of people rising up from the dead and wandering around the city, we'd have some other document attesting to it. Paul Maier completely dodges that one. So there's just no reference in here to people rising up from their graves when Jesus gets crucified. Other than that, I think everything in here is argued logically according to his point of view. Okay, so now that I've got some of the ideological stuff out of the way, maybe let me just talk about why this book is interesting and fun to read. So it's integrating Pontius Pilate's story into the larger story of Roman history during this time, the Julio-Claudian empires. So Pontius Pilate survives Tiberius, Sejanus, and Caligula, and the book ends up with the assassination of Caligula and into Claudius. So it's covering ground, those of you who like historical fiction about ancient Rome, know that this ground is very well covered in I, Claudius by Robert Graves, and also the BBC miniseries based on I, Claudius, which I've reviewed before on this channel. But in my case, I read these books before I read I, Claudius. So I think this was my first exposure to a lot of this drama about Sejanus and Tiberius. So again, this was all covered this was all covered in I, Claudius. And in the BBC miniseries, the character of Sejanus was played by none other than Patrick Stewart. So Professor Xavier from the X-Men movies, Jean-Luc Picard from the Star Trek, that Patrick Stewart. He plays Sejanus in the BBC I, Claudius series. But anyways, Sejanus is Emperor Tiberius's right-hand man, and as Tiberius is abdicating responsibilities of the empire, Sejanus is stepping in and essentially controlling everything. And Pontius Pilate is one of Sejanus's proteges, and he owes his career and his promotion to Sejanus. But if you're familiar with the story from I, Claudius, Sejanus gets a little bit too powerful, and he's abusing his power too much, and Tiberius finds out about it, and Tiberius turns on Sejanus, and Sejanus and his followers are executed, and there's a purge of all the Sejanian factions in the empire. And that is retold here. Pontius Pilate finds out about the whole story from his wife, who was in Rome during the time, and she retells all the drama to him. So you get, and again, when I read this when I was in 9th grade, this was the first I was hearing about this drama. So that's one of the reasons that these books made such an impression on me. It's an interesting drama. It's told well. And then for the rest of the novel, Pontius Pilate knows his position is precarious because anyone associated with Sejanus is getting purged, and Pilate was one of Sejanus's proteges. So now Paul Maier says in the notes to this to this book that although he's imagined some of the correspondence between Sejanus and Pilate, there's no doubt that Pilate was definitely one of Sejanus's political in Sejanus's political faction. I couldn't find that in any of the sources I read. I could have been missing something, but Paul Maier, who again is a smart guy, asserts that part was definitely true. I guess I'll take his word for it. But then the other thing is, after Pilate comes back, when he gets recalled after that disaster with the massacre of the Samaritans, then Tiberius dies right before Pilate can be put on trial for his misconduct in Judea. And then Pilate is there kind of as a bystander, kind of as a minor participant during the madness of Caligula, which makes up the ending part of this book. Caligula's infamous plan to have a statue of himself put in the Jewish Holy Temple of Jerusalem. Pilate gets sucked into that a little bit because he gets called in as an expert on Judea to some of these conferences. And then Pilate, after the assassination of Caligula and then leading up to Claudius taking the throne, Pilate is, in this novel, a minor participant or onlooker while this was happening. Now, in terms of the historical record, we lose sight of Pilate as soon as he leaves Judea. So all of that is conjecture by Paul Maier, but as Paul Maier notes in his notes, it's plausible enough, right? Pilate was around at that time, maybe. So all of that is quite interesting. The other stuff that's very interesting in this book is recreating the world of the Roman Empire in Palestine and Judea during this time. So Pilate interacts with lots of members of the Herod family, and we get into their backstories and their intrigues, and that's also quite interesting. Now, the Herod family can be a little bit confusing. There's a whole bunch of people, and they were all named Herod. I guess Herod must have been the family name. And when you read the Bible, there are several people named Herod, and sometimes it's easy to forget, or at least it was for me as a youngster, that it's not all the same Herod. So I Googled this while I was researching this book, and apparently there are 6 Herods named in the Bible. But some of them are, I think, only briefly mentioned. In terms of the Bible stories that most people know, there are 3 Herods. So there's Herod the Great. He was the founder of the Herod dynasty, and he was the Herod who is in the Christmas story. So he's the one that the wise men came to see. He's the one who ordered the massacre of the infants in Bethlehem. He is dead before the action begins in this novel, but his story is recounted by characters talking about him in Pontius Pilate. Then there is Herod, I hope I'm going to remember this right, Antipas. He is the Herod in the Gospels who was the one who had John the Baptist beheaded, and also was the one at the trial of Jesus. So when Pilate sent Jesus to be tried by Herod, that's the Herod that they're talking about. And he married a woman called Herodias. Everyone's named Herod in the Herod family, I guess, who was actually something like his niece. There's a lot of incest going on in the Herod family, which makes it a little bit hard to keep track of the family tree here. And her brother is Herod Agrippa, and Herod Agrippa is the other Herod in the Bible. That's the Herod in the book of Acts, the one who has Peter and James imprisoned, who has James beheaded, and who gets struck down by an angel because he allowed people to call him God, and has his insides getting eaten out by worms in the book of Acts. All of these are figures who appear in the Bible, and all of them are real historical figures, although occasionally there's some discrepancy between what's in the Bible and what's in other sources. So, for example, the death of Herod Agrippa, which I just mentioned, in the book of Acts, he's struck down by the hand of God. In the other sources, he dies differently. But anyways, so Herod Antipas and Antiochus and Herod Agrippa both figure prominently in this book. And Herod Agrippa is an interesting figure because he actually had a big role to play in the reign of Caligula and Claudius, which I believe I talked about when I was doing my review of Claudius the God, the sequel to I, Claudius, in which Herod Agrippa figures prominently in that book as well, because he figures prominently in the real historical record. So, yeah, the exact relationship between the Herod kings, who were not actually Roman governors, they were client kings, and between the Roman Empire, which gets adjusted back and forth a little bit in the course of this novel. So originally it was all controlled by Herod the Great. Then some of his sons appeared to be inept, and that's why there's a Roman governor, Pontius Pilate of Judea. But then, because Herod Agrippa had integrated himself so well with Caligula and Claudius, then they actually give the whole thing back to Herod Agrippa, and the whole thing becomes a client kingdom again, and kind of those shifting boundaries of the Roman province of Judea, and and the other stuff going on as well. There was an Armenian king, which Herod Antipas offends by marrying his daughter and then divorcing her to marry somebody else, and that causes a little border war on the edge of the Roman Empire. And so that's all described in this book. So this book is rich with historical detail about first century Palestine and the various relationships between the client kingdoms, the places ruled directly by Rome, and then the lands around it. So, yeah, I could go on, but I think I've talked enough. There's a lot more interesting stuff in this book that I haven't talked about. It's in the book. And as you read the book, you can go to the endnotes and check out what Paul Maier is talking about, and you can cross-reference it with Wikipedia. And, you know, if you're a history nerd like I am, you can get into that stuff and really make an interesting meal out of this. And if you're not a history nerd, then you probably won't be interested in this book anyways, right? So there you go. Thank you very much.